Now joining us to talk more about the CPPCC is Neysun Mahboubi. He's an analyst specialized in Asia studies and China-related affairs. Thanks so much for being with us. Not all of our viewers are familiar with the political system. Break it down for us, the significance of the CPPCC and the NPC.
Sure, and thanks for having me on, Mike. So the National People's Congress is, in principle, the highest organ of state power. It's composed of about 3,000 deputies who meet once a year, at this time in March. And primarily they're hearing work reports from the president or the premier and from other leaders of government departments. It's also composed of a standing committee which meets 6 times a year, a smaller standing committee of about 175 members, which does a lot of the ongoing work. But this public dimension of this meeting is very significant and is the opportunity for the deputies to express their approval or disapproval of the work reports. The CPPCC, the analyst you just had, gave a very good explanation of this very unique Chinese body, which is really a platform, I think, an approved platform for prominent citizens associated with the various political parties to participate to some extent in the state affairs. But primarily it's making suggestions for the Communist Party of China to consider and deliberate.
You're someone who watches this rather closely. What do you expect the headlines to be out of this session, these 2 sessions?
Well, this has been a very consequential period of time since the 18th Party Congress a couple of years ago, and in particular since the 3rd plenum for subjects that I personally study as a legal scholar. And I expect that the headlines will largely be related to the agenda that was set out in the 3rd and then most recently the 4th plenum of the Communist Party of China. There's also, for my purposes, a lot of that will have to do with law and legal reform. But also, as was noted just a minute ago, the environment has become a very hot issue. Just the other day, there was a very interesting documentary by a former CCTV reporter, Chai Jing, that has made a lot of waves, and people have noted it. And I think that environment is clearly going to be a big subject. And of course, anti-corruption, which is in many ways the big story of the current period, is clearly going to be on the agenda of both meetings.
You mentioned legal reform off the top. How do you expect to see the implementation of any changes there?
So there's some things that may happen at these 2 meetings, and in particular, the National People's Congress, as the legislature, may be passing laws that further the legal reform agenda. One particular law that may be somewhat specialized for your audience, but for people like me is very significant, is the law and legislation. There's some possibility that the language in the 4th plenum decision that had to do with constitutional supervision, some kind of a constitutional supervision entity within the National People's Congress, it's possible that in the revision of the law and legislation, that agenda may be pushed forward a bit. There's some possibility of environmental laws coming out of the NPC. But beyond that, a lot of the legal reform agenda is going to be carried forward by the institutions of government, like the Supreme People's Court, which is not meeting in the same way this time, but around this time of the meetings of the National People's Congress and the CPPCC, the Supreme People's Court is pushing forward its reform agenda as well. Most recently, just a few days ago, it released its new 5-year reform program. And a lot of the possible implementation of the language in the 4th plenum decision about legal reform may be pushed forward through that reform project.
Neysun, one final question. You heard the report prior to you coming on the air from Zhou Hanmin doing this interview with Han Bin, kind of talking about the CPPCC's role when it comes to corruption. How is that playing out, would you say? Anti-corruption, I should say.
Anti-corruption as a general matter, I think, is a fascinating story for people like me who study Chinese law and politics. We're really seeing things that are almost unprecedented. And I think there's a couple of different ways to break it down. One aspect has to do with so-called tigers, big names, and there have been quite a few that have already been brought down through this. And there's speculation at this time that there may be some others, and obviously we don't know, we'll have to see. But there's another dimension which has to do with so-called flies, which are the lower level officials. And in some ways, that may be a bigger problem for the party as it's trying to push this agenda forward. Just the other day, the Premier, Li Keqiang, gave a speech talking about how lower-level officials have to push forward on various sorts of projects. They can't not do things because they're afraid of being caught up in the corruption web. So there's some dilemmas there that will need to be worked out, and it may be that the discussions at these 2 meetings will help to clarify how the way forward will look.
Very interesting. Neysun, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.